Hi, everyone. I'm Atif Mian, and we are doing this series with alumni to hear about what their experience was like at Princeton and how their life is going these days and what we can learn from them. So I'm very happy to introduce Emil Verner, who is currently Assistant Professor of Finance at MIT Sloan School of Business. Emil graduated with a Ph.D. in economics from Princeton, and I had the good fortune of having Emil as my advisee at Princeton, and we had at least I had a fun time while he was here. I don't know. We'll learn about his experience, I guess. So you can be honest, Emil. But great to have you. We'll spend 20, 25 minutes chatting about your time at Princeton, what you're working on these days, and what sort of advice you may have for people listening to us and thinking about careers in academia and thinking about coming to Princeton for economics in particular. So,
sounds welcome. Great. Yeah, looking forward to the chat. It's great to see you again.
So let's start with your experience at Princeton. What were you thinking of doing coming into Princeton, and how Princeton changed you, good and bad?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. So I think when I came in to Princeton, I sort of had two interests. I was interested in development and macro, kind of long run growth type questions. Were motivated by this quote from Solo that once you start thinking about income differences across countries, it's hard to think about anything else. And at the same time, this was sort of 2012, so it was right in the immediate aftermath of the global financial crisis. And I soon realized that Princeton was really at the heart of the most exciting research on the financial crisis, on macroeconomics and finance. And as luck would have it, you had actually just arrived in Princeton that year as well from Berkeley. And you were obviously doing a lot of very exciting work in that area. And so I sort of gradually started gravitating more and more toward finance and thinking about the financial crisis and trying to understand it. And I realized that there were many things that I just didn't understand as well as I could. And so that was kind of a very exciting time and place to be interested in those types of questions. And then I really used the opportunity kind of at Princeton, the broad depth of the faculty, the different fields, to really kind of focus on macro, international economics and finance. And that kind of became what I was focused on in a variety of different ways for basically the next 5-6 years in my time there. And we started working together, I think the summer after my second year. Did some research assistantship for you, and then the ball started rolling from there, and got very interested in kind of empirical macroeconomics and finance, understanding bad recessions, financial crises, where they come from, what causes them, can we predict them, all those types of exciting questions that were very important at the time, and I think are still of great interest.
Emil, tell us something about your dissertation, and in particular your job market paper, which, by the way, obviously did very well. Published was the lead article at American Economic Review. But what I want to talk about is the process leading up to the paper. Everyone can read the paper and see, how successful that project became. But of course, you don't know that starting out. And I want to get a little bit into the process of sort of developing that project and sort of what broader lessons there might be for students starting out research.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was sort of a consequence of a bit of luck, a bit of persistence, and sort of things, I think, coming together. So for those who don't know, the paper studies how a large exchange rate shock is transmitted to the real economy through household balance sheets in the context of an emerging market where households have a lot of debt denominated in foreign currency. So when there's a depreciation of the exchange rate, that leads to a big increase in real debt burdens for households that have foreign currency debt. And I was interested in understanding, why did households get borrow in foreign currency in the first place, or why do they often do this in emerging markets, and how do they adjust when these types of shocks happen, and what are the real consequences of these types of shocks? And I was coming at those questions actually from inspired by some work that you had done, and also that we had done together, looking at household credit cycles. It turns out that the big booms in lending to households and household credit, they often end in big busts, and that was something that our work had helped establish. And when I was putting together some of the data that we were using, I realized that in some countries around 2008, 2009, there were big spikes in household debt. And I was wondering, what's going on here? Everyone's talking about, bank credit contracting, it's hard to get a loan. Why are there are these contexts of household debt actually jumping in places like Iceland and Austria and Poland and Hungary? And it turned out it was because these countries had a lot of foreign currency denominated debt, and those spikes in some of the data we were looking at were actually due to revaluations of that debt, not due to new lending. And so I think, remember, we were in your office kind of talking about different potential ideas, and you said to me, why don't you look into some of this foreign currency debt? It's something that people aren't really talking that much about, but it seems like it's potentially an interesting topic to investigate. And it turned out, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they had written a bit about mortgage borrowers in Poland or Hungary that had, gotten themselves into big trouble because of these risky loans that they had taken on, but there wasn't really so much academic research. And so you basically said, try to see if you can find some data. And so I kind of sent a few emails around and was trying to, be a bit persistent in terms of finding the data. And it turned out that at the Central Bank of Hungary, they had this credit registry that had loan currency denomination. That was sort of the key variable that was hard to find. So all of the loans that had been originated in Hungary from starting around 2000 up until the present, so we could see every single borrower, how much they had taken, what they were taking the loan for, where they lived, and so on. And so I said, okay, they have this data in Hungary. I have to go to Budapest. What should I do? And I remember you basically said, get on the plane, go to Budapest, go there. And so I spent a summer there, and no one had really used the data for research yet. It had been used a bit in policy, but so the first month I spent there with the person who became my co-author, Kyozo Gimyozi, and we were cleaning the data, making sure it made sense, making sure that it looked like a reasonable series when we aggregated all those types of things that you want to do. And then it sort of gradually evolved into actually a series of different papers that we wrote, including my job market paper, which was really this iterative process of looking at the data, coming back to Princeton, presenting it within the seminar in Princeton, getting feedback, trying to refine it, get more data, and sort of that iterative process then turned into the job market paper. And so I went for the first time in the summer of 2016, and then the paper was basically ready in the fall of 2017. It took about a year and a half or so. And then we were kind of working on follow-up projects, actually even to this day. But it wasn't sort of ex post. It might look like it was an obvious thing to do, but ex ante, it was really just kind of being a bit lucky and persistent and looking for data and finding the data kind of and finding kind of interesting patterns in the data once I got my hands on them.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to just highlight the ex ante sort of uncertainty and risk that goes on in these kind of endeavors. But one has to be, this is one thing I remember, Emil, about you in particular, is sort of if one has a conversation like the one you mentioned, I was always amazed by how quickly you would come back with like having made a lot of progress. And so I think that was always impressive, but it also is like a wide set of skills that you need, not just on the technical side, but also reaching out to people, being persistent, being nice when you talk to them, so they are willing to partner with you, they're willing to talk to you, they're willing to work with you. I mean, all of those things matter at the end of the day.
And let me also say, I mean, for grad students or potential grad students watching this, I think I probably applied to about 10 different sources of data. And I think 2 or 3 of them worked out. One of them, I think they only got back to me once I was already on the job market, sort of 2 years too late. So, there were many unsuccessful attempts as well. But that whole process is also, you learn a lot by doing it, because then you realize, there might be other sources of data that you didn't even know about or hadn't thought about asking for, and then you start to talk to people. So that's kind of a part of doing, I think, applied research as well.
And that sort of batting average, right? 2 to 3 out of 10. I mean, that sounds just about right. I mean, I think baseball is a good metaphor. I think batting average is kind of, if you can get 1 out of 3, that's like really, really good, right? And so that's the way to think of it. Which, just briefly, maybe can you mention the unsuccessful one, so people know it's not always a good story?
Yeah, I mean, so I was interested in a sort of related question about how firms choose their currency denomination of their debt at the same time as how they choose what currency to price their goods in. And one of the ways to look at that, where you can actually see currency invoicing, is in the BLS's microdata from their international price program. And those are very nice data that other people have used. And so I applied to get access to those. And actually they did get back to me, but it was just a little bit too late relative to when the job market. I think it took a little bit too long, and I was a bit too late in applying. So that's another thing. If you want to apply for data, whether it's census data or something, you need to give yourself a lead time of a couple of years at least. And then there were others I've already, some of them I've forgotten, who just you never even hear from.
Yeah.
But
yeah, exactly. And the other thing to keep in mind is sort of, when you start, and if you're successful, then you can build an agenda around it. So then often it's not just one paper, but one thing leads to another sort of a thing. And so when you're starting out your career, it's almost by definition much harder. It gets easier over time because you have something built up, so you can use that capital you have built up and then continue to build incrementally new capital. But it always takes a little bit of time to sort of have the fixed cost of starting your career for the first time. I think that's important to keep in mind, that perspective for students.
Exactly, yeah. And it can be also a bit of an uncertain and a bit stressful time, because you're looking for the hook. You're trying to get your hands onto something, but then once you get it, then often there's other ideas that you can generate from the same data, and you can write multiple papers sort of within the same area. And we were kind of able to do something similar. So we wrote one paper which was more on the macrofinance side of how this type of shock was transmitted. And then we realized, well, there's lots of things happening on the political economy side of cleaning up from the crisis. And it turned out that there were some interesting patterns in the relationship between people's foreign debt exposure and their voting behavior, and how that changed during the crisis. And that was a very different set of questions than what I was initially interested in, but it turned out to actually be related, because I think the political side is an important side of financial crises that kind of I started thinking about only later. So in some sense, you have to also keep the faith a little bit and kind of trust the process, that ideas will come out of the process, out of looking for data, working with data.
Exactly. I sometimes tell students, look, the real world is a lot more interesting than your models. And so when you go look at the data and you think about the real world, you'll actually get even more exciting ideas than you might first think of with the paper and pencil. There's something else you did when you were at Princeton, which is you also kind of started forming partnerships and collaborations on sort of these long historical projects, collecting long-term historical data, which is a different enterprise than sort of working with administrative data of the sort you worked on for your job market paper in Hungary. So tell us about that, like how, and then you've continued to do that. Maybe if you have time, we'll come back to your sort of recent, very nice work with Karsten Muller as well. But how do you how did you get into sort of working on more of sort of history and macrofinance?
Yeah, it's a good question. So initially, kind of going way back, when I thought about what I wanted to study, I think top of my list was I wanted to study history. So I've always really been fascinated by history. And then for a variety of reasons, I sort of decided maybe that wasn't the best field to study in undergrad. I was also interested in math. And so economics seemed like a good compromise there. But so I'd always been interested in history and read history. I think I remember reading some advice that Paul Krugman wrote about how he looked for good research ideas. And he said that Rudy Dornbush told him, go and read, history books, economic history. Don't necessarily just read the latest, theoretical papers, but read through history. And so I think especially in macrofinance, a lot of the knowledge that we have, some of it is maybe more narrative or was more narrative or informal, but really came from history. So for example, what the impact of monetary policy was, well, a lot of the received wisdom kind of has come from the major monetary policy shocks or events, like the return to the gold standard in the 1920s, or leaving the gold standard in the 1930s during the Great Depression, or and that sort of work was always kind of very influential in thinking about macrofinance. And I definitely felt that at Princeton too. Many professors would talk about the Great Depression or talk about history and motivating kind of empirical or theoretical work. And sort of at the same time, there was this trend, I think, because it's become cheaper and the cost of collecting lots of data and long run data has come down. There was kind of this trend within macrofinance to do those types of endeavors. So for example, Jorda, Schulark, and Taylor have done a lot of important work in that area. And my co-author, Matt Barron, who was a few years ahead of me, has also written some very, very good and interesting papers using that approach, getting long run time series, for example, on credit, on GDP, on banking crises, and trying to just understand what are the basic macro finance facts. What is it that sort of we should try to understand in our models? What is the connection? Are banking crises completely unpredictable, or do they seem to, for example, follow certain types of macroeconomic trends or booms? And I think that historical work has put together a lot of facts that some of them maybe we could have intuited before by reading narrative history, but we really sharpened that work. And so I was kind of lucky to be at Princeton around that time and to kind of get excited by that area. And it started actually with a paper that we wrote together with Amr Sufi, where we were looking at longer run trends in household credit and documenting the importance of kind of household credit cycles for business cycles. And that was, long run data going back to 1960. And then it turned out, well, you can actually, in some cases add another 50 or 60 years, go back to the pre-war World War II period, the Great Depression, and even earlier, and learn things. And so in a subsequent paper with Wei Shang and Matt Barron, we started looking a bit more at, identifying what were the major banking crises and what were the characteristics of those types of banking crises. Were there bank failures? Were there banking panics? What's the difference between those two things? Can we try to measure them in the data? And what are sort of the salient features of a banking crisis? How should we try to think about that? I think long run data is very important for those types of questions if you want to do empirical work, mainly because we just don't have that many experiences of banking crises in a given country and time period. And so kind of one wants to look at the long run historical perspective for that. And I think that's been quite a fruitful approach that complements the more kind of well-identified micro data based approach in modern data. So I see them kind of as two ways of adding our knowledge in macrofinance.
That's right. And if you think of some of the more influential work in economics, it's about bringing new facts out there, and that's fundamentally about sort of data construction. And that's one thing I think, when maybe because of the boot camps we have in the beginning, that PhD students coming in, they might overemphasize the value of technique, which is of course important, not to take anything away from that, but there's also a lot of value in just thinking about putting new facts together, putting new data together in ways that hasn't been done before, to shed light on what we may have been missing in the past. And so that's a great way to kind of develop your career, and you're continuing to do that. You're continuing to work in developing new data sets. Tell us about your transition from being a student to going, obviously faculty at MIT. How is it different? How, it's a sort of, you have to think differently about managing your work, your 24 hours in a day. How has the transition been for you, or what advice would you have for young academics starting out?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one thing I would say to people who are still PhD students is really, I remember thinking it was very stressful and having a lot of anxiety, but you really also want to enjoy that time. One, because you really have a lot of time actually to do work and to build skills and maybe read a little bit more broadly than you can do later in your career. Because kind of the main thing that I've noticed is the way that I work has changed a little bit, in the sense that I have a bit less time myself, but I have more resources as well. And so it becomes about thinking a little bit more kind of at a higher level, trying to be organized and think about sort of how to kind of get research progressing when you can't necessarily work on a given paper 10 hours per day every day, because you have all of a sudden other responsibilities, whether it's more responsibilities through teaching, advising, lots of other things that they ask us to do. And so in that sense, the way that I've worked has maybe changed a little bit, but I still try to, every day make sure I block out at least a few hours, if not more, to be working with data myself or to be working on writing myself. So still kind of trying to work like a PhD student in some sense, and taking advantage of the more resources that you have once you become an assistant professor. Other than that, I mean, in some ways, MIT and Princeton are not so different. So I'm in the finance group at Sloan. And so in that sense, I've noticed that I'm getting a bit more exposure to finance relative to macro, whereas at Princeton, because the finance group was in the economics department, it was maybe a little bit more integrated with the whole economics community. But here we're in the same building. You just have to go down one elevator and up another elevator, and you're in the economics department. So I've been trying to kind of keep that connection to other areas of economics, especially going to the macro seminar and interacting with macro folks. And I think that's nice, so that's kind of similar relative to Princeton.
How about teaching business school students? Obviously, you were not in a business school before.
Yeah, no, I wasn't in a business school. I didn't know that much about business schools really before I went on the job market. I will say, I think that the preparation that we get at Princeton just for going on the job market, so preparing to present your research, distilling ideas in a clear and simple way, and explaining it so that people who are maybe not in your field will understand it. That skill actually, I think, translates relatively well into teaching, because that's sort of the same thing that we're trying to do, is take ideas that are maybe complicated, make them simple, make sure that students can understand them. So I've been teaching MBA, now Sloan Fellows MBA, which is a mid-career MBA program. So I teach essentially a mix of investments and corporate finance. So basic kind of finance theory with a mix of some theory and also a fair number of cases. And actually that's gone quite well. I've learned a lot. So I've learned a lot of, I think, also kind of more practical finance that's actually served me quite well in some of my research as well. So there's been some nice synergies there. And then the cherry on the cake is getting to do some PhD teaching as well. So in the second year PhD, and that's a way to kind of force yourself to stay sharp and stay on top of recent papers. So the transition has been quite smooth.
Right. So looking forward, we are sort of closing the end of our session here, but I want to talk to you about like what you are thinking going forward, just in terms of questions and ideas that you feel are important in this sort of macro finance space that you have been working on. Now you have a lot more perspective, right? It's been like a few years out since you finished your PhD, you've been remarkably successful. Hopefully that's giving you pause, thinking about, okay, you know, I don't, or at least you should not be anxious anymore. Like you've done well and you're doing well. So it gives you a different perspective, right? And I want to sort of hear you tell us what that transition is like what kind of questions are you thinking about now that you maybe have a different perspective, have a different horizon looking forward, and what motivates you in terms of research going forward?
Oh, yeah, that's a very good question. So I think in some sense, what I realized is for about 10 years of my life or so, this is a realization I had kind of over the past 1 or 2 years. For about 10 years of my life, I'd really been thinking about financial crises from one perspective or another, whether it was kind of from the perspective of bank failures and panics, or from the perspective of household debt and financial distress for households and firms. And I think I kind of reached a stage where I felt like I had said what I wanted to say sort of for now on that, and wanted to look for some other topics. And that was really the first time I kind of felt myself in that position. Not to say that I'm not going to write other papers or come back to that, but just for a little while, I wanted to think about other things. And I got very interested in sort of financial aspects of inflation, especially high inflation. And so this is sort of where kind of my interest in history again sort of came back and was sort of influential in my thinking. A lot of the ways that we've thought about inflation, especially high inflation, is again something that we've learned from history, whether it's the 1970s inflation in the US and other parts of the world, or the really big inflations, the hyperinflations in Europe in the 1920s. And I went back and I sort of wanted to read and understand more how those high inflations shaped economic activity and broader society, especially through financial channels. And so that's some of the work that I've been doing more recently, is going back and actually collecting a lot more data from the 1920s in Europe, where we actually have a lot of data, not even just aggregate data, but actually firm level data, so micro level data on firms, to try to understand, for example, during the German hyperinflation, was that an economic catastrophe, or did the economy actually do quite well? Well, it turns out actually for much of the hyperinflation, the economy was booming. People weren't happy about it. It was a miserable time. Many people lost their savings, but lots of firms actually benefited a lot. And it turns out that many of the ideas that we think about that were useful for thinking about big recessions or depressions are also useful for thinking about big inflation. So for example, there's a lot of redistribution that happens when there's unexpected inflation because of nominal contracts. So for example, nominal debtors winning and nominal savers losing. And so in kind of my work at the moment that I'm most excited about is kind of a series of projects trying to understand sort of the real economic consequences of high inflations, especially through kind of financial channels. And so I have kind of a recent paper on that and a few other projects that are sort of exploring that side of it, to kind of look at some of these big historical episodes to see if we can maybe learn about some economic mechanisms that might even be relevant for current times, like today as well, even though it's a very sort of different type of inflationary experience that we're having today.
That's right. Yeah, inflation has certainly become a lot more salient now than before. Thank you so much, Emil. It was a real pleasure. Obviously, we had limited time, so we can't go into as much detail as we would like to, but it's been terrific talking to you about your research and where you're heading next. Wish you all the best, continued success, and thank you to all the audience who would listen to us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Atif, and it's great to see you. Hope to see you soon in person.
Of course. All the best. Thanks.